Here's something that should genuinely disturb you. Right now, on your phone, there is almost certainly an app, maybe a game, maybe a social platform, maybe a music service that you use every single day. You know the logo, you know the interface, you probably think you know who owns it. You don't. Because somewhere in the fine print, buried under layers of holding companies, shell structures, and offshore investment vehicles, the real owner is a single corporation that most people in the West couldn't name if their life depended on it. That company is Tencent, and by the time you finish watching this video, you are going to feel genuinely unsettled about how much of your digital life this one company silently controls. We're talking about a company that owns a piece of Fortnite, a piece of League of Legends, in fact, the whole thing, a piece of Spotify, a piece of Snapchat, a piece of Tesla, a piece of Activision Blizzard, a piece of Reddit, a piece of Universal Music, a piece of over 700 companies worldwide. 700 companies. This isn't diversification. This is a quiet, systematic, almost surgical takeover of the global entertainment and technology economy, executed over 2 decades with a level of patience and precision that makes every other tech company on Earth look like an impatient child. And here's the part that keeps analysts up at night. The man who built all of this, who turned a tiny Shenzhen startup into a $500 billion shadow empire, is someone most Americans genuinely cannot name. He doesn't do TED Talks. He doesn't post on X. He doesn't show up on magazine covers next to Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg. He doesn't want you to know his name. His name is Ma Huateng, known online as Pony Ma, and the empire he built operates on one core principle that Western tech moguls never quite figured out. The most dangerous power is the kind nobody notices. But here's where the story gets truly dark, because for a company this powerful, this deeply embedded in the infrastructure of modern digital life, Tencent has spent years operating in a space with almost zero accountability, no serious Western regulatory oversight, a cozy, complicated, and deeply controversial relationship with the Chinese Communist Party, and a business model so vast and so interconnected that by the time anyone started asking hard questions, the tentacles were already everywhere. This is the story of how one man from one city in southern China built the most disturbingly powerful company you've never heard of, how they bought the world, and how, for a very long time, they answered to absolutely no one. But to understand how this empire became this untouchable, we have to go back to the very beginning. The year is 1998. And Shenzhen, China is not Silicon Valley. It's loud, chaotic, and brutally competitive. A city that only really existed in its modern form because the Chinese government decided to make it a special economic zone. Basically, a controlled experiment in capitalism dropped inside a communist state. Shenzhen is the place where China stress tests money-making, where ambitious young men come to either get rich or get destroyed. Into this city arrives a 27-year-old computer science graduate named Ma Huateng. Pony Ma, as he'd come to be known, is not the kind of founder that makes for a good Hollywood biopic. He's quiet, intensely private, reportedly so shy that in early meetings he would sometimes stare at his laptop rather than make eye contact with investors. He is the opposite of Steve Jobs. He is the anti-Elon Musk. No reality distortion field, no grand theatrical speeches about changing the world, just a cold, calculating brain that understood one thing better than almost anyone alive. What do people actually want to do online, and how do you make money from every single thing they do? He co-founds Tencent in November 1998 with 4 other partners. The name itself, Tencent, is a rough translation of tenacious combined with cent as in money. Right there in the name, stubborn pursuit of money. These people were not hiding their intentions. Their first product is QQ, and this is where the story starts getting interesting. QQ is basically a clone, a straight-up, barely disguised copy of ICQ, an Israeli instant messaging service that was hugely popular in the late 90s. Tencent looks at what works in the West, strips it down, and rebuilds it for a Chinese audience. Cheaper, simpler, faster, and China goes absolutely insane for it. By 2001, QQ has over 100 million registered users. In a country where most people were only just getting online for the first time, QQ becomes the internet, not a part of the internet, the internet. If you were in China and you wanted to talk to someone digitally, you used QQ, full stop. Now, here's something crucial to understand about Pony Ma's psychology, because this defines everything Tencent becomes. He wasn't satisfied with just having users. He wanted to live inside those users' lives. He wanted Tencent to be so deeply embedded in the daily routine of every single Chinese person that removing it would feel like ripping out a vital organ. This is not the language of a tech entrepreneur. This is the language of a strategist, an occupier. And the first sign of what Tencent was truly capable of comes in the early 2000s when they launched QQ Show. QQ Show lets users customize their digital avatars, buy them virtual clothes, accessories, digital pets. Silly stuff, right? Pointless vanity features? Wrong. In the first year alone, Tencent makes tens of millions of dollars selling fake clothes for fake digital characters. Real money. Tencent had just discovered something that the entire Western gaming industry would spend years trying to figure out. People will pay real money for things that have zero physical existence. This is the insight that funds the entire empire. This single revelation about human psychology, about vanity, status, and the desire to be seen is what turns a messaging app into the most powerful digital ecosystem on the planet. But Pony Ma has a problem, because around 2005-2006, Tencent is massive inside China. But the company is increasingly seen, even by Chinese observers, as a shameless copycat, a pirate operation, a vampire that sucks the blood out of original ideas created by smaller startups. There's a famous phrase in Chinese tech circles from this era: if Tencent copies you, you're done. Small companies would spend years building a product, gaining traction, and then Tencent would clone it, use their distribution advantage to flood the market, and drive the original into the ground. It happened over and over and over again. A company called Foxmail builds a popular email client. Tencent clones it and then just buys Foxmail and hires its founder. A product called Qzone, a social networking feature, gets launched by a competitor. Tencent builds their own version overnight and bundles it directly into QQ, making the competitor irrelevant within months. By 2010, the Chinese tech press is openly calling Tencent a monster. There are government discussions about whether this one company has become too powerful. Pony Ma, as usual, says almost nothing publicly. He doesn't need to, because while the critics are writing think pieces, Tencent is building something that will make QQ look like a warm-up act. In 2011, they launch WeChat, and WeChat changes everything. If you live outside of China, here's what you need to understand about WeChat, because most Western users genuinely cannot conceptualize what this app actually is. WeChat is not a messaging app. It's a messaging app, yes, but it's also a social media platform, a payment system, a ride-hailing service, a food delivery platform, a government document submission portal, a healthcare booking system, a news feed, a gaming platform, a business operating system, and an identity verification tool. In China, you can pay your electricity bill on WeChat, you can book a doctor's appointment, you can file your taxes, you can order food, book a flight, split the bill at dinner, send money to your parents, run your entire small business, and read the news, all without ever leaving the app. This is what Western tech companies spent the last decade trying to build and failing. Facebook tried to become a super app. Twitter tried. Google tried. None of them pulled it off. WeChat did it in China in the early 2010s. And the reason it worked wasn't technical genius, it was leverage. Tencent already had 800 million QQ users. They migrated those users to WeChat with almost zero friction. By 2013, WeChat has 300 million users. By 2015, it's over 600 million. Today, it's 1.3 billion monthly active users. 1.3 billion people, nearly 1/5 of the entire human population, is active on a single app controlled by one company with deeply complex ties to an authoritarian government. And while the world is watching Facebook and Google and obsessing over Silicon Valley, Pony Ma is sitting quietly in Shenzhen, looking at his WeChat data, which tells him literally everything about what over 1 billion people eat, buy, say, believe, vote for, and worry about, and thinking, now,
we go global. Keep watching, because what happens next is where Pony Ma's genius starts to look less like brilliance and more like something far more dangerous.
Here's the thing about Tencent that most people completely miss. They didn't become a global empire by building great products for the world. They became a global empire by buying the world, piece by piece, quietly, methodically, while everyone else was looking somewhere else. And the architect of this strategy isn't some aggressive, loud, chest-thumping Wall Street type. It's Pony Ma, sitting in boardrooms, barely speaking, signing checks that other people won't even understand the significance of for another 5 years. This is the investment phase, and it is one of the most audacious, patient, and frankly terrifying corporate acquisition strategies in the history of modern capitalism. Let's start with gaming, because gaming is where Tencent makes its first truly global move, and where the scale of their ambition becomes impossible to ignore. In 2011, the same year they launch WeChat, Tencent acquires a majority stake in Riot Games, the studio behind League of Legends. The price? Roughly $400 million. At the time, people in the gaming industry thought this was interesting, but not alarming. A Chinese company buying an American game studio. Fine, whatever. League of Legends is popular, sure, but it's just a game, right? Except here's what those people didn't understand. League of Legends was about to become the most played PC game on the entire planet. By 2012, it has 32 million registered players. By 2014, 67 million. By 2016, it's generating over $1 billion a year in revenue, almost entirely from virtual items, from digital skins, from fake cosmetics for digital characters. Sound familiar? Tencent had cracked this code back in 2003 with QQ Show. They recognized the model instantly. They didn't just buy a game studio, they bought the infrastructure of $1 billion virtual economy. And then they go after Epic Games. In 2012, Tencent acquires a 40% stake in Epic Games, the studio that will eventually give the world Fortnite and the Unreal Engine. The Unreal Engine, for those who don't know, is one of the most widely used game development platforms on the planet. Hundreds of studios use it to build their games. When you play a game built on Unreal Engine, Tencent is quietly collecting a licensing fee somewhere in the background. But they're not done, not even close. 2016, Tencent acquires Supercell, the Finnish studio behind Clash of Clans and Clash Royale. Price tag? $8.6 billion. At the time, it's the largest gaming acquisition in history. Sit with that for a second. A Chinese company, largely unknown in the West, just paid $8.6 billion for a Finnish mobile game studio. No fanfare, no splashy press conferences. Pony Ma doesn't fly to Helsinki to ring a bell or take selfies with the founders. The deal is announced, the money moves, and Tencent gets quietly, incrementally more powerful. Then comes the move that makes every serious tech analyst stop and stare. In 2017, Tencent acquires a 5% stake in Tesla. They buy 8.17 million shares, spending roughly $1.78 billion to become one of Elon Musk's most significant early investors. Tesla, the electric car company, the energy company, the company that Elon Musk has since turned into one of the most consequential technology ventures on the planet. Tencent saw that coming in 2017. They put nearly $2 billion on it. Around the same time, they take a significant stake in Snapchat, $2 billion for roughly 10% of the company. They invest in Spotify. They invest in Universal Music Group. They invest in a company called Sea Limited, which dominates e-commerce and gaming across Southeast Asia. They invest in Meituan, China's dominant food delivery platform. They invest in JD.com, China's second largest e-commerce platform. And here's the one that should genuinely make your jaw drop: Reddit. In 2019, Tencent leads a $150 million funding round for Reddit, taking a significant ownership stake in arguably the most influential forum on the English-speaking internet. The same Reddit where millions of Americans discuss politics, share news, build communities, and form opinions, partially owned by a Chinese tech company with documented ties to the Chinese Communist Party. The reaction online is immediate and furious. Reddit users, who have a long and proud tradition of protesting anything they don't like directly on the platform, absolutely lose their minds. Threads explode, memes go viral. The front page of Reddit fills with posts mocking and condemning the very platform they're posting on for selling out to Chinese interests. And Reddit's response is a masterclass in corporate tone deafness. They basically shrug. They say the investment doesn't affect operations. They say Tencent is a passive investor. They say nothing will change. Which, to be fair, in terms of day-to-day operations was largely true. But that's almost beside the point. The point is the principle, the optics, the fact that one of the West's most politically vocal online communities is now partially funded by a company operating under Chinese law, which, under the national security law, requires companies to cooperate with Chinese intelligence services upon request. That is the detail that people couldn't get past, and it wouldn't be the last time Tencent's investment strategy would blow up into a major scandal. But let's zoom out for a second, because to fully understand the scale of what Tencent is building, you need to understand their domestic dominance first. Because the Chinese market isn't just where they make money, it's where they built the blueprint for everything. By the mid-2010s, Tencent's WeChat Pay and Alipay, Alibaba's equivalent, have essentially replaced cash in China. Not reduced cash, replaced it. You could go weeks in major Chinese cities without touching physical money. Everything from street food vendors to luxurious boutiques accepted WeChat Pay. Small business owners, farmers, taxi drivers, everyone had a QR code. This means Tencent has real-time visibility into the spending habits of 1 billion people. Think about what that means. Not in an abstract data is valuable Silicon Valley way, in a very concrete, very immediate way. Tencent knows what you buy, when you buy it, where you were when you bought it. They know what you eat, what you wear, what medications you purchase, which hospitals you visit, how much you donate to charity, whether you gamble, whether you drink. They know who you transfer money to and how often. This is not surveillance in the way most people imagine surveillance. This is something far more efficient and far more invasive. This is algorithmic, automated, constant, total behavioral mapping of an entire civilization, and Tencent sits right in the middle of it. Now, here's where the story shifts. Here's where Tencent's seemingly unstoppable trajectory starts developing cracks. Because while Tencent has been vacuuming up investments and building this data empire, they've been making a series of assumptions that, in hindsight, look less like strategic thinking and more like the dangerous overconfidence of a company that has never truly been challenged. Assumption number 1, that their relationship with the Chinese Communist Party is an asset, not a liability. Assumption number 2, that Western regulators would remain either too ignorant or too slow to scrutinize their investment strategy. Assumption number 3, that their gaming revenue, which by 2020 represents roughly 30% of their total income, is a permanent, untouchable cash machine. All 3 of these assumptions were about to be proven catastrophically wrong. And the man who would destroy the first assumption wasn't a Western regulator, a rival CEO, or a crusading journalist. It was Xi Jinping. Let me explain what happens, because this is the part of the Tencent story that Western media consistently underreports, probably because it complicates the simple narrative of Tencent as a villainous CCP puppet. The reality is messier, more dramatic, and honestly, far more interesting. By 2020, Tencent is one of the most valuable companies in the world. Their market cap peaks at around $930 billion in early 2021. Pony Ma is one of the wealthiest people on the planet. WeChat is so essential to daily life in China that it has effectively become a branch of national infrastructure. And Xi Jinping looks at all of this and sees a problem. Not an ideological problem necessarily, not a capitalism is bad problem, a power problem. Because any entity, any company, any organization, any individual that becomes powerful enough to be truly indispensable to the daily lives of 1 billion people is by definition a potential rival to the state. And in Xi Jinping's China, the Communist Party does not tolerate rivals. The crackdown begins in late 2020, and it starts not with Tencent, but with Alibaba and Jack Ma. Alibaba, the flamboyant, media-savvy founder of Alibaba, gives a speech in October 2020 that explicitly criticizes Chinese financial regulators. He compares Chinese banks to pawn shops. He implies that the government doesn't understand innovation. 3 weeks after that speech, Jack Ma essentially disappears from public life, and Alibaba's financial arm, Ant Group, is forced to cancel what would have been the largest IPO in history just 2 days before it was set to launch. A $37 billion offering, canceled. Just like that. The message to every tech billionaire in China is received loud and clear. You are not untouchable. You never were. Pony Ma watches all of this happen to his greatest rival, and unlike Jack Ma, who apparently believed his own legend, Pony Ma is smart enough to read the room. But reading the room isn't enough, because the government doesn't just come for Alibaba, they come for everyone. In 2021, Beijing launches what analysts call the Tech Crackdown, a sweeping series of regulatory interventions targeting China's biggest tech companies simultaneously, and Tencent is directly in the crosshairs.
In August 2021, Chinese state media publishes a piece calling online gaming, Tencent's biggest revenue driver, spiritual opium. They describe video games as an addiction destroying Chinese youth. The piece is so explosive, so deliberately inflammatory that Tencent stock drops 10% in one day. 10% in one day because of a newspaper article. That's how much power a state media outlet has when the government is sending a message. And the government's follow-up action makes the article look subtle.
Beijing announces strict new regulations for gaming for minors. Children under 18 are now limited to just 3 hours of gaming per week. 3 hours total. Tencent, which makes enormous revenue from its mobile games played by young users, is suddenly facing a regulatory wall that cuts directly into their growth engine. But that's just the beginning. The government orders Tencent to stop new user registrations for WeChat, ostensibly for a security review. They fine Tencent hundreds of millions of dollars for antitrust violations. They force Tencent to give up exclusive music licensing deals. They block Tencent's proposed merger with a major video streaming platform. And then, in a move that sends shockwaves through the global investment community, a state-backed entity takes a small but symbolically enormous stake in a Tencent subsidiary, installing a government representative on the board. The message is no longer subtle. We own you now. We always did. You just forgot. Tencent's market cap, which was $930 billion at its peak, collapses. By early 2022, over $500 billion in market value has been erased. $500 billion gone in under a year. For context, that's more than the entire market value of companies like Nike, McDonald's, or Netflix, just evaporated. And Pony Ma, true to form, says almost nothing. He doesn't rage publicly. He doesn't flee the country. He doesn't give defiant interviews. He complies. He pivots. He survives. But the damage isn't just financial. Something more fundamental has been exposed. The entire premise of Tencent's power, the idea that this company was a self-directed, independently operating global empire, turns out to have been at least partially a fiction. They were never fully sovereign. They were always operating inside a system that could rewrite the rules at any moment. And that system had just reminded them of that fact in the most brutal terms possible. But here's the thing. Here's the twist that makes this story genuinely complicated. Because while Tencent is getting obliterated domestically, their global investments are still sitting there. Riot Games, Epic Games, Supercell, Snapchat, Spotify, Reddit, Tesla, hundreds of other companies spread across dozens of countries. And now, Western governments who had been largely asleep on this issue for years are suddenly, urgently awake. The questions start flying. If Tencent is partially under the control of a government that can demand data on demand, compel corporate behavior under law, and install representatives on company boards, then what does that mean for all those Western companies that Tencent has a stake in? What does it mean for Fortnite, which is played by hundreds of millions of children worldwide? What does it mean for the Unreal Engine, which powers games, films, and virtual productions globally? What does it mean for Reddit, where American political discourse is shaped daily? These are not paranoid questions. These are the questions that regulators in Washington, Brussels, and London are now scrambling to answer. And the fact that they're only asking them now, a full decade after Tencent began its global acquisition spree, is a staggering indictment of Western regulatory attention spans. Tencent built the cage, then they put themselves in it. And now, everyone on the outside is trying to figure out what exactly is locked inside with them. But the real chaos, the true public reckoning, that hasn't even started yet. Let's talk about what happens when the world finally wakes up. Because the thing about Tencent's empire is that it wasn't built in secret. Not really. The acquisitions were public. The disclosures were investments. The financial filings existed. Any journalist, regulator, or politician with a laptop and a few hours could have traced the tentacles. They just didn't. And then, almost overnight, they did. All of them at the same time. The catalyst isn't one single event. It's a perfect storm of geopolitical tension, public outrage, regulatory panic, and a series of controversies so damaging, so perfectly timed, that even Tencent's legendary PR discipline couldn't contain the fallout. Let's start with the moment that brings Tencent into living rooms across America. The year is 2019, and a storm is brewing that has nothing to do with Tencent directly, but will drag them into the center of the most explosive political controversy in modern sports history. Daryl Morey, Houston Rockets general manager, posts a tweet, 7 words, "Fight for freedom, stand with Hong Kong." 7 words that trigger a diplomatic crisis between the NBA and China, cost the league an estimated $400 million in Chinese broadcasting revenue, and force every Western corporation with significant Chinese exposure to answer a question they had been desperately trying to avoid. When Beijing's interests conflict with Western values, whose side are you on? Tencent has a $1.5 billion deal to stream NBA games in China. They are the NBA's largest international partner. And when this tweet drops, Tencent is suddenly sitting at the exact center of the most uncomfortable political Venn diagram imaginable. The Chinese government demands the NBA condemn Morey. The NBA, after an embarrassing, mealy-mouthed initial statement that tries to please everyone and pleases no one, eventually stands by free speak. Tencent suspends NBA broadcasts in China. The entire relationship fractures in real time, publicly, uglily. And for millions of Western observers watching this unfold, a question crystallizes that had never been so stark before. Just how deeply are our cultural institutions entangled with a company that operates under Chinese government authority? The NBA thing is messy and dramatic, but it's almost a warm-up for what comes next. In 2020, a global pandemic begins in Wuhan, China, and almost immediately, WeChat becomes a focal point of intense international scrutiny. Not because of anything Tencent does after the pandemic starts, but because of what researchers begin documenting about what WeChat was doing in the months before the world knew COVID-19 existed. Researchers at the Citizen Lab, a cybersecurity watchdog based at the University of Toronto, publish findings that WeChat was censoring keywords related to COVID-19 as early as January 2020, not just in China, on international accounts belonging to users in Canada, the United States, Europe. Let that sink in. An app being used by Chinese diaspora communities worldwide, people using it to communicate with family back home, to run businesses, to maintain cultural connections, was having their conversations filtered and monitored, not just by Chinese authorities, but across international borders, without any of those users' knowledge or consent. The Citizen Lab's findings are meticulous and damning. They document how WeChat's content moderation systems don't just apply to users inside China, they apply based on account origin, meaning accounts registered with Chinese phone numbers are subject to Chinese censorship rules, regardless of where in the world that person actually is. This isn't a hypothetical privacy concern. This is documented, real-time censorship of communications happening on servers that may be located outside China, conducted on behalf of a government that has no legal jurisdiction over the people whose conversations are being filtered. The backlash is immediate. Human rights organizations condemn it, tech journalists dissect it, politicians cite it. And Tencent, faced with this level of specific, documented, evidence-backed accusation, essentially says nothing meaningful. Their response is the corporate equivalent of a shrug. They issue vague statements about complying with local regulations. They imply that censorship on Chinese registered accounts is simply a legal requirement they have no choice but to follow, which is technically true, and which is precisely what makes it so damning. Because "we had no choice" is not a defense when you're the company that built the system, when you're the company that designed the architecture that makes this level of surveillance technically possible, when you are in fact the system. But even the pandemic censorship scandal is not the moment that truly threatens to crack Tencent's Western empire open. That moment comes from an unexpected direction: gaming. Specifically, the question of what Tencent's gaming platforms are doing with children's data and whether the safeguards they claim to have in place are real or theater. Let's go back to PUBG Mobile, one of the most downloaded mobile games in history with hundreds of millions of active players globally. Developed by a South Korean studio, yes, but published and operated in most of the world by Tencent Games. In 2020, India bans PUBG Mobile completely, citing national security concerns about data being routed to servers in China. The ban affects over 50 million Indian users overnight. It's the largest gaming ban in history. India then bans over 200 Chinese apps in total, including TikTok and dozens of others. The scale of the regulatory action is unprecedented, and the reasoning is explicit. These apps represent a data sovereignty risk. The Indian government believes and presents evidence suggesting that data from these apps is being stored and potentially accessed in China. Tencent's response to the India ban is telling. They don't fight it aggressively. They don't mount a major public campaign. They explore restructuring options. They try to create distance between the game's operations and Tencent's Chinese infrastructure, but the ban sticks. 50 million users. Gone. And it sets a precedent that other governments start looking at very carefully. The United States is next, and this is where things get truly explosive. In August 2020, Donald Trump signs an executive order targeting WeChat, directing that transactions with WeChat be prohibited within the United States within 45 days. The stated reason, national security. The actual reason, and this is important, is a political calculation wrapped around a genuine security concern that existed long before Trump decided to weaponize it. The WeChat ban creates immediate, genuine panic in Chinese-American communities across the US. For millions of people, WeChat isn't an optional social media platform. It's their primary means of communication with elderly parents in China who use no other digital platform. It's how small businesses in Chinatowns across America process payments. It's how Chinese international students coordinate their entire social lives. The human cost of the proposed ban is real and immediate, and Chinese-American advocacy groups file lawsuits challenging the order. Federal judges issue injunctions blocking it. The legal battle becomes a constitutional mess involving First Amendment arguments, national security exemptions, and questions about executive authority. The ban never fully goes into effect, but the damage is done, not to Tencent's operations, but to their reputation. Because now, for the first time, a sitting US president has formally labeled WeChat a national security threat. That label doesn't disappear when the lawsuit wins or when administrations change. It becomes the permanent conversation about Tencent. But here's where the story gets genuinely complicated. And this complication is something that most YouTube videos about Tencent conveniently skip over because it doesn't fit a clean narrative. Not everyone in Washington agrees on what the threat actually is. The hawkish position, held by figures across both parties, is that Tencent is essentially an arm of Chinese state intelligence, that the National Intelligence Law of 2017, which requires Chinese companies to support, assist, and cooperate with Chinese intelligence services, means that any data Tencent holds can effectively be considered accessible by Beijing. The more nuanced position, held by some tech policy experts and civil liberties advocates, is that this framing, while not entirely wrong, is also being used opportunistically, that the same arguments being made about Tencent could theoretically be made about any large platform company, that American tech companies also cooperate with US intelligence agencies, and singling out Chinese companies purely on nationality has its own troubling implications. Both positions have genuine merit, and the fact that both exist is part of what has made it so difficult for Western governments to act decisively. Because regulating Tencent isn't simple. You can't just ban Tencent in the West the way India banned PUBG. The tentacles are too deep. Riot Games employs thousands of American workers. Epic Games, partially Tencent-owned, runs the Unreal Engine that powers a significant portion of Western game development. Banning Tencent's investments would require unwinding a corporate structure so complex and so deeply integrated into the Western tech ecosystem that doing so would cause enormous collateral damage. So instead of decisive action, what you get is a years-long theater of investigations, committee hearings, proposed legislation, and ultimately, not much. The Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, CFIUS, reviews Tencent's investments. They take a hard look at the Grindr acquisition, where Tencent-backed Beijing Kunlun had bought the gay dating app and was found to be storing American users' sensitive personal data on Chinese servers. Grindr is forced to be sold. That's a win for the regulators. But Riot Games? Epic? Untouched. And while Washington deliberates, Tencent's global investment machine barely slows down. Let's talk about something that almost nobody covers: the music industry. Tencent Music Entertainment, the company's music streaming arm, controls roughly 70% of China's music streaming market. But more significantly, Tencent has taken major stakes in Universal Music Group, Warner Music Group, and Sony Music Group, the three largest music labels on the planet. Three companies that between them control the vast majority of commercially released music in the world. When music industry veterans start doing the math on this, the reaction is somewhere between alarm and disbelief. Because what this means in practical terms is that a company operating under Chinese law has significant financial leverage over the companies that decide what music gets promoted, which artists get deals, and how the global music industry allocates its resources. Does this mean Tencent is directly influencing music industry decisions? Not necessarily, not provably. But the conflict of interest is structural. It's baked into the ownership. And the music industry, never exactly known for its transparency, is deeply, deeply uncomfortable talking about it. Then there's the Activision Blizzard situation. In 2022, when Microsoft announces its intention to acquire Activision Blizzard for $69 billion, one of the factors that complicates the regulatory review process is the question of Tencent's existing stake in Activision. Regulators on multiple continents are suddenly having to untangle ownership webs that involve a Chinese tech giant's fingerprints all over deals that were supposed to be purely Western corporate transactions. But perhaps the most viscerally outrageous controversy, the one that generates the most genuine public anger, involves something far more personal than music rights or gaming acquisitions. It involves children. In 2018, a video goes viral in China. A child, estimated to be around 10 years old, has apparently been spending money on mobile games. Not a little money, the equivalent of thousands of dollars. Money taken from family savings, from a parent's work account, from a grandparent's retirement fund. This isn't one isolated case. Journalists begin documenting dozens, then hundreds of similar incidents. Chinese parents sharing stories of children secretly spending staggering sums on virtual items in Tencent games. Honor of Kings, Tencent's most popular mobile game in China, with over 100 million daily active users, becomes the specific target of intense parental rage. The criticism is direct and devastating. Tencent has deliberately designed these games to be psychologically addictive. They have built systems specifically engineered to exploit the impulsive spending tendencies of minors. They have made it as easy as possible to spend real money with as little friction as possible, knowing that a significant portion of their players are children. Tencent's response is to implement age verification systems and spending limits for minors. But the investigation into how these systems actually work reveals something deeply uncomfortable. The facial recognition technology Tencent uses to verify whether a player is actually a minor? Children figure out workarounds within weeks of implementation. Kids use their parents' phones. Kids use photos of adults to fool face recognition systems. The limits are real on paper, but porous in practice. And perhaps most damning of all, investigators find that Tencent's own internal documents, later surfaced in various legal proceedings, show that the company was fully aware of how central underage spending was to their revenue model. They knew. They had the data. They had the analytics showing exactly how much of their mobile game revenue was coming from users who were almost certainly minors. They implemented the minimal possible intervention and called it responsibility. This pattern of knowing exactly what harm your platform is causing, calculating the minimum response necessary to quiet the critics, and then continuing to profit from the harm is not unique to Tencent. Facebook does it, Instagram does it, YouTube does it. But when Tencent does it, there's an added layer of horror.
Because unlike Facebook or YouTube, Tencent is not subject to the kind of sustained adversarial journalism and congressional scrutiny that at least creates some external pressure for change. Tencent operates in a media environment, domestically, where that kind of scrutiny is essentially impossible, where the journalists who would pursue that story either can't publish it or don't exist in the numbers necessary to sustain the pressure. And internationally, they benefit from obscurity, from the fact that most Western consumers don't know they're using a Tencent product when they fire up Fortnite or stream music on Spotify or read threads on Reddit. That invisibility is the most powerful weapon in Tencent's arsenal, and for years it works perfectly, until the moment it doesn't. Because by 2021-2022, the combination of all these scandals, all these investigations, all this accumulated outrage starts producing something Tencent had never had to seriously deal with before. Consequences. Real ones. The Indian ban stands. The regulatory pressure in Europe intensifies, with GDPR investigations into WeChat's data practices. The US Congress holds hearings, admittedly more theatrical than substantive, but hearings nonetheless, where Tencent's investment strategy is picked apart, publicly, on camera for the first time. And then the Chinese government's crackdown, which we discussed in Act 2, produces a consequence that no Western regulator managed to achieve. It forces Tencent to sell. Under pressure from Beijing's antitrust regulators and the broader tech crackdown, Tencent begins divesting major positions in some of their most high-profile investments. In 2022, they announced they are reducing their stake in JD.com, worth approximately $16 billion, by distributing the shares as a special dividend to Tencent shareholders. They reduce their position in Sea Limited. They trim investments across their portfolio. The company that spent a decade buying everything is now being forced to sell. And the optics are extraordinary, because this isn't Tencent making a strategic business decision. This is Tencent complying with political pressure from their own government. The most powerful tech company in China, the company that was supposed to represent the triumph of Chinese technological ambition, is being unwound at the command of the same state it was supposed to be a jewel of. Pony Ma, through all of this, maintains his silence. He doesn't fight publicly. He doesn't give tearful interviews. He doesn't rage on social media. He attends party meetings. He makes the appropriate public statements of support for the party's policies. He complies. And in a deeply cynical way, this compliance is its own form of statement, because it confirms what many observers had argued all along. Tencent was never truly independent. Pony Ma's empire was always conditional. The freedom to build was always granted, not inherent, and it could always be revoked. The man who seemed so untouchable, who had spent 20 years building an empire that no one could challenge, turns out to have been living in a house that someone else owned the whole time. But here's the darkest twist of all. Even diminished, even under regulatory siege from both East and West, even with $500 billion of market cap erased, even with forced divestments and government board members and gaming revenue restrictions, Tencent is still worth hundreds of billions of dollars. WeChat still has 1.3 billion users. Tencent Games still dominates mobile gaming globally. The investments in Riot, Epic, and Supercell still generate billions in annual revenue. The empire took damage, real, serious, historic damage, but it didn't fall. And that resilience, that sheer scale, might be the most disturbing part of this entire story. Because when the dust settles, the question isn't whether Tencent survived. It's what the survival of a company like this tells us about the world we've built. Let's talk about where we are now, because this is the part of the story that most people don't want to sit with. The uncomfortable, unresolved, deeply unsettling ending that doesn't have a hero, doesn't have a clean moral, doesn't have a villain getting handcuffed on the courthouse steps while the crowd cheers. This is the part where we look at what's left. And what's left is, frankly, a lot.
Pony Ma, the man who built all of this, is still there, still running Tencent, still one of the wealthiest human beings on the planet with a net worth that fluctuates between $30 and $50 billion depending on the day and the market. Still based in Shenzhen, still almost pathologically quiet in public. He did something interesting in late 2021, right in the middle of the Chinese government's tech crackdown. He essentially vanished from public view for several months. No statements, no appearances, no social media, nothing. The speculation was intense. Had he been detained? Had he fled? Was he negotiating privately with government officials? Was he pulling a Jack Ma? And then, quietly, he reappeared. At a party congress, sitting in the audience, applauding at the appropriate moments, looking perfectly fine. He hadn't fled, he hadn't been arrested, he hadn't fought back. He had simply waited, stayed low, let the storm pass over him, and then got back to work. This is Pony Ma's superpower, and it's also the thing that makes him, in many ways, the perfect symbol for everything Tencent represents. Because in the age of the loud, performative tech CEO, in the era of Elon Musk tweeting markets into chaos, and Mark Zuckerberg testifying before Congress in a suit that doesn't fit, and Sam Altman doing his wide-eyed, "I'm just a humble servant of humanity" routine at every major policy forum, Pony Ma simply doesn't play that game. He understands something that his Western counterparts have consistently failed to grasp, that visibility is vulnerability, that the CEO who becomes the face of the company becomes the target, that the man who stays invisible stays powerful. While Jack Ma was giving speeches that got him erased from public life, Pony Ma was sitting silently in the back of the room. While Mark Zuckerberg was being grilled by senators who didn't know what the internet was, Pony Ma was signing acquisition papers. While Elon Musk was posting memes and picking fights with everyone on Earth, Pony Ma was quietly restructuring Tencent's investment portfolio to comply with Beijing's demands while simultaneously protecting his global asset base. He is, in a word, patient. And patience, sustained, strategic, almost inhuman patience, turns out to be the most dangerous quality a corporate empire builder can have. But let's not make the mistake of framing this as pure admiration, because Pony Ma's patience hasn't just been about self-preservation, it's been about complicity. Here is the thing that deserves to be said plainly, without diplomatic hedging. WeChat is a surveillance tool. Not metaphorically, not in the way that people loosely describe Facebook as surveillance, literally, structurally, by design. The Citizen Labs research and subsequent work by academics at multiple Western universities has documented that WeChat monitors communications, filters content, and builds detailed behavioral profiles on its users, including users outside China. This data is, under Chinese law, accessible to state security services. What does the Chinese state security apparatus do with this data? In some cases, we know exactly what they do with it, because there are documented cases of Chinese dissidents, human rights activists, and critics of the government being identified, tracked, and persecuted based on digital communications that passed through WeChat. There are documented cases of people in Western countries, Chinese diaspora communities in Canada, the United States, Australia, being subject to harassment campaigns coordinated through information that appears to have been derived from their WeChat communications. There are documented cases of WeChat being used as a vector for what Western intelligence agencies describe as transnational repression, the ability of an authoritarian government to project its coercive power beyond its own borders, into liberal democracies, targeting its own citizens who have fled abroad. Tencent built the infrastructure for this. WeChat is the pipe through which this repression flows, and Tencent continues to operate WeChat, continues to profit from its 1.3 billion users, continues to improve its systems and expand its capabilities. This is not a scandal in the conventional sense. There's no single incident, no explosive leak, no whistleblower with a USB drive full of damning documents. It's something more insidious than a scandal. It's a structural condition, a permanent feature of the platform. And structural conditions are much harder to address than scandals because they can't be resolved with a press conference and a policy update. Now let's talk about gaming, because the gaming story has a chapter that isn't finished yet, and it's one that should concern anyone who thinks about what these platforms are doing to young people. Tencent is, by most measures, the largest gaming company on Earth. Not just in revenue, though they generate more gaming revenue than any other company in the world, but in terms of reach, in terms of the sheer number of human beings, globally, who engage with entertainment products that Tencent either owns outright or has significant financial stakes in. Fortnite, League of Legends, PUBG Mobile, Honor of Kings, Call of Duty Mobile, Clash of Clans, Clash Royale, Valorant, Path of Exile, Warframe, Pokemon Go. Yes, Tencent has a stake in Niantic. The list goes on and on and on. These games collectively have hundreds of millions of active players. A significant portion of those players are minors, and every single one of these games is built around what the industry clinically calls behavioral addiction systems. Variable reward schedules, artificial scarcity, social pressure mechanisms, FOMO engineering, loot boxes that operate on the same psychological principles as slot machines. The research is accumulating. Studies published in peer-reviewed journals are documenting correlations with heavy gaming engagement, particularly with games using these mechanics, and symptoms consistent with addiction, depression, anxiety, and impaired impulse control in adolescence. And Tencent, the company that pioneered the virtual goods monetization model back in 2003 with QQ Show, is not just participating in the industry. They are in many respects the company that wrote the playbook that the entire industry follows. They invented the model, they perfected it, they exported it globally. And now they sit at the center of a multi-hundred-billion-dollar industry built on engineering human psychological vulnerabilities for profit. The safeguards they've implemented, the minor protections, the spending limits, the time restrictions, are real but insufficient. They are the minimum viable response to regulatory pressure, not a genuine commitment to user well-being. And here's the cynical truth. They will remain insufficient for exactly as long as making them sufficient would cost more money than the fines and reputational damage of leaving them insufficient. That's not unique to Tencent. That's the logic of every platform company on Earth. But Tencent operates this logic at a scale that makes everyone else look like a minor league player. Now, let's talk about the geopolitical situation, because this is evolving in real time, and the trajectory is not reassuring. The tension between China and the Western world, particularly the United States, has not decreased since the peak of the Tencent scrutiny in 2020 and 2021. If anything, it is intensified. Taiwan, trade wars, technology export controls, the chip wars, the slow, grinding decoupling of the world's two largest economies. In this environment, Tencent sits in an extraordinarily precarious position. Domestically, they are still subject to the Chinese government's ongoing desire to prevent any single tech company from becoming too powerful. The crackdown has eased somewhat. Beijing realized that obliterating its own tech sector was counterproductive to its own economic ambitions, but the fundamental dynamic has not changed. Tencent operates at the pleasure of the party, always has, always will. Internationally, their investment portfolio is increasingly being viewed through a national security lens rather than a purely commercial one. The United States has tightened CFIUS reviews. The European Union is implementing the Digital Markets Act and exploring new foreign investment screening mechanisms. Australia, the UK, and Canada are all developing more aggressive frameworks for scrutinizing Chinese tech investment. The window that Tencent exploited so brilliantly throughout the 2010s, the window of Western regulatory naivety, of open capital markets and laissez-faire attitudes towards foreign investment, is closing. Slowly, imperfectly, but closing. Which raises a question that nobody has a clean answer to. What happens to all those investments? Riot Games, Epic Games, Supercell, the stakes in Spotify, Snapchat, Universal Music. What happens to those when, not if, but when the geopolitical pressure reaches a point where Western governments feel compelled to act more decisively? The answer is that nobody knows, and the uncertainty itself is damaging, because the companies that have Tencent as a significant investor are now operating under a permanent cloud of geopolitical risk. Their valuations, their operational independence, their ability to make long-term strategic decisions, all of it is subtly but genuinely complicated by the Tencent question. This is the collateral damage of allowing the investment to happen in the first place, and it's a damage that will take years, possibly decades, to fully unwind. But here's what I want you to leave you with, the thing that I think is the real lesson of the Tencent story, not the obvious lesson, not Chinese companies bad, or open markets dangerous, or regulation good. Those are all too simple, too clean, too comfortable. The real lesson is about what we choose not to see, and why we choose not to see it. Tencent built this empire in plain sight. Every acquisition was reported, every investment filing was public. The WeChat censorship research was published by credible academics and covered by serious journalists. The gaming addiction concerns were documented and discussed. The national security implications were raised by intelligence officials in multiple countries. None of it was hidden. All of it was visible. And yet, for over a decade, the Western world essentially looked away. Governments looked away because the money was good and the disruption of acting was inconvenient. Consumers looked away because the products were fun and free and friction-free. Investors looked away because the returns were extraordinary. Media looked away because the story was complicated and didn't have a simple villain or a simple victim. We built a world where capital flows freely and accountability follows slowly, if at all, where the speed of corporate expansion has completely outpaced the speed of regulatory response, where a single company can spend 10 years systematically buying its way into the infrastructure of global entertainment, communication, and culture, and by the time anyone asks hard questions, the answers are already too complicated to act on cleanly. Tencent didn't break the rules, they played by the rules that existed. And the rules that existed were designed, whether intentionally or through negligence, to allow exactly this kind of empire to be built. That's not Pony Ma's failure, that's ours. Now, let me tell you where the key players are today, because the endings of these stories matter. Pony Ma is still CEO of Tencent. He remains one of the most powerful people in the Chinese tech industry. His public profile, if anything, has gotten even lower since the crackdown. He has made donations, massive headline-generating donations to Chinese social causes, to rural education, to common prosperity initiatives. These donations are simultaneously genuine philanthropy and very deliberate political theater, signals to Beijing that he understands his place in the new order. He is worth somewhere between $30 and $50 billion. He has lost more money on paper than most humans will ever see. The crackdown wiped out enormous personal wealth, but he is still, by any reasonable measure, one of the most powerful individuals on the planet. Tencent, the company, reported revenue of over $80 billion in 2023. Their gaming division, despite the crackdown, despite the minor restrictions, despite the spiritual opium controversy, is still generating billions annually. WeChat is still growing. Their cloud and enterprise businesses are expanding. The divestments they were forced to make freed up capital that they have been strategically redeploying. The company that everyone said was finished is not finished. It is restructured, it is more cautious, it is operating under new constraints. But it is not finished. And Riot Games is still making League of Legends. Epic is still running Fortnite. Supercell is still printing money from Clash of Clans. Hundreds of millions of Western users are still engaging daily with entertainment products that flow revenue back, ultimately, to a company in Shenzhen that operates under the legal authority of the Chinese Communist Party. Nothing fundamental has changed. Which brings me to my final thought, the one I want you to carry with you after this video ends. We live in an era of enormous corporate power, power that has outgrown the institutions designed to check it. Power that operates across borders in ways that national regulators cannot effectively monitor. Power that is exercised not through dramatic, visible actions, but through the slow, patient accumulation of ownership stakes, data flows, and infrastructure dependencies. Tencent is the most extreme example of this phenomenon, but it is not the only example. It is not even the most dangerous example necessarily. It is simply the most visible one, once you know where to look. The question the Tencent story forces you to ask is not, what do we do about Tencent? That question, frankly, is already years too late. The question is, what other Tencents are being built right now? What other patient, invisible empires are in their early stages, buying quietly, accumulating methodically, staying below the radar of public attention until the moment when they are too embedded to dislodge? What are you using right now, on your phone, on your laptop, in your daily digital life, that you think you understand but don't? Because if the Tencent story teaches us anything, it's this: the most dangerous power is always the power you don't know is there. And by the time you find out, it's already too late.